sin is overrated, right? So one of the things we're doing when we sing together is we're engaging not only in maturity, but we're engaging in mature Christian speech. We're helping one another discern through careful practice between good and evil. Well, there's a third category, a third area that Paul's been pretty interested in throughout the book of Ephesians, and that is the body. Paul's pretty concerned that these Ephesian Christians don't use their body for sin, but that they use their body for righteousness. So in chapter 4, verse 17, he describes the state of the Gentile perspective on the body, and he says that they've given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. And in chapter 5, verse 3, he says, "But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not be even named among you, as is proper among the saints." And then right before he tells us to sing, he says, "Don't get drunk with wine." Again, don't engage in this physical activity because that physical activity is debauchery. So Paul's been telling us what not to do, but where has he told us what to do with our bodies? Well, he tells the thief in chapter 4, no longer steal, but work with your hands. There's one place. But the main emphasis of what we're supposed to do with our bodies comes in chapter 5. And it's introduced that way because in chapter 5, verse 1, Paul actually says to be imitators of Christ, who offered himself up for us as a fragrant offering to God. So Paul presents in the book of Ephesians two ways to use your body. You can either use it as some sort of sensual amusement park purely for your own gratification, or you can use your body the way Jesus used his body, and that is to make it an offering to God for the sake of others whom God loves. Well, worship, this is one of the most fundamental things about singing, is that this is the union of heaven and earth. This is the union of material and immaterial. It's the union of material and spiritual, or corporeal and spiritual. It's us participating in the great design with which God created all things, and that was a union of the supernatural, of the spiritual, and the material. And singing is an activity that takes place within our bodies, but it's happening in our bodies, our physicality, but it's like kissing up against and engaging in and dancing in the invisible and the supernatural and the spiritual. So singing together is this really interesting activity in which we uniformly as a people say, hey, we've got these bodies, we've got these lungs, we've got these voice boxes, we've got these back muscles, we've got this body, we've got this breath. Let's together do the thing with our bodies that God has told us to do, and that is to offer them, to make them instruments, to make them useful in displaying the goodness and glory of God. So I want you to always think about, if you can, when you sing, that this is an act of bodily worship. Singing is a physical act. Singing depends primarily on breathing. And breathing is probably the most fundamental activity of the body. And the idea of breath and God and the Spirit, all of these things are interwoven throughout the scriptures. And the difference between the shape of a man with muscles and ligaments and tissue and so forth, the difference between that and a man is what in Genesis? The breath of God. God puts his breath into us. And so one of the things that we're doing when we sing is we're utilizing this very fundamental part of our existence, and we're making it serve God. That's probably really good, right? To take the most fundamental baseline things about our body and make them serve God. And it's really interesting because not only is using your body this way really really glorifying to God, but it's actually physically good for you. There's been a lot of study about singing and what happens in the body when someone sings, and especially when people sing together in groups. And the primary kind of category for study in that area has been choirs. And most of the choirs that exist in the world are Christian, and most of them are so. The data is heavily weighted in one particular direction. But just as an aside, one article I read said that calculating all the muscles used and so forth, if you weigh 150 pounds, you'll burn about that many calories if you sing for an hour. So, like, maybe we should sing for an hour. I don't know, But one of the other really interesting things that was shown, again, this is all discussing like what does singing actually do? We use our bodies to sing. We use our bodies to glorify God. That's really good. But as is usual, when God gives us some command, it's for our good in some way that we don't see. And we're just now discovering that, man, singing is actually really good for the body. There's all sorts of hormonal things that they're figuring out is going on when we sing. We release endorphins and oxytocin is a bonding agent, and so it makes you feel more connected to the people that you're singing with. This is even true when they've studied vocalists or people in choirs who are going through really difficult situations and compared them against people who are also going through difficult situations but not engaged in group vocal activities. They're just seeing all of this evidence that singing is really good for us. And in fact, one of the key things going on in human singing that doesn't exist anywhere else in nature is we are the only creature that engages in what they call non-competitive singing. So all the other singing that you hear in the world, whether that's frogs or birds or whatever, that's all sex selection-based competitive actions. So it's signaling. So my job in that situation is to sing louder than the bullfrog next to me, or whatever. But humans have a very unique thing going on when they sing. And one of the things going on, this is pretty helpful, especially if you're kind of more of a left-brained person, is that singing is really doing a lot in our right hemisphere. It's really doing a lot in our creative, holistic, kind of viewing the forest from the trees kind of world. So in many respects, I find that the people who like singing the least are the people who need it the most. Because the people who like singing the least are usually left-brain dominant people, and but singing is uniquely, our accessing music is uniquely happening on the right side of the brain. In fact, there's something kind of weird going on because the left side of the brain, there aren't many activities like this. The left side of the brain perceives like the meaning of lyrics, and the right side of the brain perceives the melody. And so God's design for music is, among many other things, is to like engage like our whole being, even parts that don't normally play well together, our whole being in worshiping Him. It's really quite amazing. So then you also see Paul's concern with the mind. He says in verse 17 about those Gentiles that one of their main problems is that they have futile minds. Whenever I hear the word futile, I always just think of like a truck tire stuck in a big old mud hole, and it's spinning, and there's lots of horsepower and lots of power and lots of intention, and it's just throwing slop everywhere. It's not actually getting any traction. When Paul talks about the futility of a person's mind, I think that's a fair image. It's like you've got this intellectual horsepower, and you've got maybe even good intentions, but if you are engaged in futile mindfulness, then you're never going to get any traction into the truth. So Paul's concerned, that he says in verse 23, chapter 4, be renewed in the spirit of your minds. Well, one of the things that's most fundamental to thinking well is to see the thing behind the thing. And we've talked about this before. This seems to be the real key to thinking well, is to understand what's going on behind the thing that's right in front of you. And of course, unfortunately, we've adopted that to some extent in the culture, maybe more than we ever have, where we say, what's the scientific thing behind the thing that we're saying? What's the scientific thing behind the phenomenon we're saying? But then suddenly, and this is entirely a spiritual problem, see, science will encourage you to be curious, to ask 3 questions of why. But then when the fourth question demands a spiritual answer, they say, stop being curious. Stop looking for the why behind that why. So the real key to like being renewed in the spirit of your mind is to say, what's the why behind the why behind the why behind the why? It's asking the ultimate things behind the things we see. It's really just first principle thinking. Well, the Bible actually predicts this. The Bible says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. And so being able to see the thing behind the thing behind the thing, being able to see God behind all things is actually what makes us knowledgeable in a real sense and not just in a sophist sense, and also wise. Well, guess what activity helps us to remember the thing behind the thing behind the thing? Well, that's what worship is, right? Worship is the connection of the works of God to the person of God. Whether we sing How Great Thou Art and we talk about, thunder and sunsets or whatever, or we sing a song about the cross or redemption, I once was lost, but now I'm found. However we look at it, what we're doing is we're starting with a work of God. Creation, salvation, the church. And we're going backward and we're asking, where did that come from? And worship leads us to the why behind the why. It leads us to the ultimate answers to things, which is the Lord himself. And so worship is actually probably one of the most intellectually healthy things you can do. It's probably one of the things that helps you actually be renewed in the spirit of your mind more consistently because it gives you the tools you need to ask the why behind the why behind the why and refamiliarize yourself with what the Bible says is the creator of all things, the source of all things, the one who upholds all things by the word of his power, the one for whom all things were made, by the one who made all things, and so on. So when Paul's concerned about the mind, it makes sense to say, hey, you guys should worship together. You guys should together sing about the whys behind the why. Paul's also concerned about unity. He says in chapter 3, verse 19, you are no longer strangers and aliens, but are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. And then he says in verse 3 of chapter 4, be eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Corporate worship is one of the rare things that a church our size gets to actually do all together. It's pretty hard for us to all eat dinner together. It would be really hard for us to all have one Bible study together that was meaningful and sort of interaction and so forth. There really aren't a lot of things that we can all do together. How many of you have ever wanted to be part of a barn raising, an Amish barn raising? Am I the only one with this fantasy? Okay, I figured there were other weirdos like me who have watched that and thought, okay, that looks pretty cool. I really would encourage you to think about singing together on a Sunday morning as a weekly practice of monument raising, where God brings us in after a week of various circumstances and difficulties. Some of us are up, some of us are down, and so on. And really, no week is ever the same. The Spirit's never doing the exact same thing one Sunday morning to another Sunday morning. But the beautiful thing about a barn raising is that all these people are working together, and some of them are better than others, and so on and so forth. And there are definitely leaders. There's definitely a hierarchy existing within a barn raising and so forth. And there are people who are making lemonade. There are people who are fitting mortise, joints. But the point is that the goal is let's get together on a Saturday and build this monument. Let's get together and erect this thing. And then at the end of it, we've all worked together and we've made this thing happen. Well, that's really what God wants us to think of when we think about corporate worship. Every Sunday morning, we gather together. Some of us are better at singing than others. There's a hierarchy. There's people that are in charge and so forth. But literally, we all get to do this thing together. And there are very few things that a church gets to actually do together. So corporate worship is, I think, essentially a weekly example of barn raising. Only the thing we're raising is invisible, and it's a monument to God, to his faithfulness to us that week. Okay, so those are some of the kind of what I think is going on here is why did Paul drop into this level of granularity and specificity right then? Ephesians 5:19. Well, corporate worship is uniquely kind of able to address a bunch of the themes that he has been talking about. Now, I want to just ask the question, go back to the text and ask the question, well, what do we get any clues when we look at the verse about what the quality of our singing together should look like? So look back at verse 19, where it says, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So first question would be, how do we know this command is what I'm talking about? How do we know this is a command to sing together? Maybe we're just supposed to walk up to each other and say, start singing. I think when I was young and I read this, I thought, well, that would just be weird. But I assumed that's what it was talking about. It's like, well, I don't know if I'll ever get so mature and lose so much self-consciousness that I'll just be able to walk up to people and sing psalms to them. Know that it's not that it's actually talking about corporate worship. Well, you got two indicators. One is the Greek word used here really does seem to be used, the word for address really does seem to be used quite often for addressing crowds, though it's not the only way it's used that way a lot. But more importantly, that word psalm and hymn, these are words that really carry with it the sense of musical accompaniment. So I guess it's possible that you're supposed to walk up to people, but really when you look at this, most commentators think that those two clues together imply that this addressing one another is what we call just corporate worship. John Stott puts it this way: the reference is to Christian fellowship, and the mention of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, which are not easily distinguishable, although the first word implies a musical accompaniment, indicates that the context is public worship. Whenever Christians assemble, they love to sing to both God and to each other. Now, the basic final point to develop in this talk is to correct for an overcorrection that has taken place within our conception of worship, and that is perhaps best summarized by the phrase, I'm singing for an audience of one. Now, probably heard that, probably nothing wrong with it. It was probably meant to overcorrect something else. But what we want to notice, just as a way of correcting for the correction, is that we want to notice that actually in this text, the emphasis is horizontal. Right? The emphasis is horizontal. I'm going to balance that out here in a minute. But the real focus of singing here is to address one another. So I want to think about that mostly as we work our way through this text further. So the key idea here is no, you are not only singing to the Lord. You are also singing to one another. And that makes sense. Let me try to help you see why that fits kind of what we know about the kingdom. When Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, what does he do? He gives two. And the two is one is vertical and one is horizontal, right? When Jesus is asked what's the singular greatest commandment, he says, love God with all your being and love your neighbor as yourself. In the kingdom, whatever going on vertically with you and God is meant to overflow into what's going on with you and your brothers and sisters. And this starts all the way with the Trinity, when the Trinity creates together, and everything that we know about God and everything we know through the gospel, it's all because the Trinity has related well to one another, God has related to God, and now God is relating to man. So we want to make sure when we come for corporate worship, we understand that a decent part of our job is to actually sing to one another. That's a big part of the job. Look at Colossians. I think we've got this slide, Colossians 3:16. Colossians has got some challenges related to unity and so forth. And one of the resolutions to these challenges is the command in Colossians 3:16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Almost the same thing that we see in Ephesians, with this one innovation. Teach and admonish one another is preceding the call to sing to one another. And there's some question about whether or not those two things are fitted together or not. But I would just tell you this. When we sing, when we address one another, we do indeed teach and admonish one another. That is part of what happens in corporate singing. When we sing together, we are teaching and admonishing one another. Mark Merker is a pastoral assistant at Capitol Hill Baptist Church, and they have, in my opinion, one of the best theologies of corporate worship of any local church I've ever been a part of. And he wrote an article that kind of describes some of this, and commenting on Colossians 3, he says, in other words, Paul has just signed up every believer for the choir. Remember, each week we gather as wounded people to have our spiritual sores treated by the great physician. In his mercy, he uses our songs to the Christian enduring persecution from his biological family needs to hear the dozens or hundreds in his spiritual family sing, Jesus, I my cross have taken, all to leave and follow thee. The believer struggling hard against shame needs to watch you exult in my sin, not in part, but in whole, has been nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. The saint overburdened by work, striving, and performance needs to listen to you as you affirm, we rest on thee, our shield and our defender. There's another place where this really jumps out at me, and it's in Psalm 42. The writer of Psalm 42 is really struggling with depression. And in verse 3, he says, my tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all day long, where is your God? So in an effort to battle his own spiritual depression, he says, these things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. So John Piper kind of comments on that so helpfully, where he says, oh, how much could be said here about the importance of corporate worship in our lives. Don't take these times together lightly. What we do here is a real transaction with the living God. God means for these encounters with him in corporate worship to preserve your faith now and in the way you remember them later. If corporate worship were not a real supernatural work of God, it would be pure sentimentalism for the psalmist to remember his experiences. He is not engaging in nostalgia. He is confirming his faith in the midst of turmoil and discouragement by remembering how real God was in corporate worship. How much more serious should we be about corporate worship? Ask the Lord to show you what is at stake here. So we really are singing to one another in a substantial way. And I just want to pause and thank everyone who's involved in leading us in corporate worship every Sunday. These people are, you guys are clappy people, all right. You know, like a lot of work goes into this, and not only work, but time, and not only time, but there's been personal expenditures of finances to make things happen and so on. So I just want to say thank you to all of you who lead in corporate worship, because this is that important and it is that meaningful to the people of God over the long term. And one more thing I haven't mentioned at all, I could have just talked only about the effect this has on our children, because it's substantial. So now let's just do one quick pass through this text again and look at very practical things. First thing we see is this list of psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. What does that mean? Well, as stop to distinguish what those are. So what's the point? Why is Paul listing these this way? Well, I think the big takeaway, gloriously multifaceted God, and we need many musical tools at our disposal to proclaim his goodness. And we probably don't have enough. We don't have enough notes. We don't have enough instruments. We don't have enough song forms. But we surely need these, and we need all of these. But I think another takeaway here is that because you are here to sing to one another, the question of personal preference related to the kind of song you sing is just not a substantial question. If you're going to ask a question about what we sing, the question should be asked, what can we sing to bless others? Not, what can we sing to bless me? If you hold this as a ministry with which you are responsible to walk in on a Sunday morning and minister to one another in singing, then the real question isn't, what do I want to hear?